I'm Micah Redding, and I'm here with Jonathan Rauch, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, a contributing writer of The Atlantic, and the author of numerous books on public policy, culture, and government. His latest book is Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. So thank you, Jonathan, for being with me today.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here.
So I wanted to say, first of all, that I thought this was a brave book to write because of what you say to Christians, what you say to many in the secular world. I think this creates an opportunity for a lot of misunderstanding and misconstrual. So I want to get in a few minutes to maybe what has been misunderstood about this book. But let's start with the question. What is the main message? What is the main thrust of this book? And what are you trying to put out into the world with this?
The bumper sticker version is that America is becoming ungovernable, and that's for a few reasons, but one of them is the failure of Christianity, and that we secular liberals have a stake in the health and revival of a more Christ-like Christianity.
Okay, so let's start with what's ungovernable here. Like, what's wrong with society as you see it? You know, maybe somebody looks around, maybe not looking at the stock market today, but maybe in general, and feels pretty good about where society is. What would you say is wrong with what we're doing or where we're going?
Well, our society is riven with the worst polarization, partisan polarization we've seen since the Civil War. And it's an especially dangerous and difficult type of polarization. It's called affective polarization. It's not about policy, taxes too high or too low, or the environment, or even a difficult issue like abortion. It's about, I hate and fear the other side. It's genuine sense of threat about the other side. And that's just very hard for a democracy to cope with. We also see increasingly that people have invested partisan politics with an almost religious sensibility. They're getting their sense of identity and purpose from doing partisan politics, and it can't sustain that. Politics is supposed to be about figuring out how to get along together, not splitting ourselves into basic tribes. We're seeing social indicators of all kinds go south. Deaths of despair, loneliness, depression, anxiety, isolation, especially among younger people. And all of those things are happening at once. And it's, a lot of sociologists and a lot of people see a number of reasons for that. We can talk about cell phones and social media and dating apps and whatnot. But this has all gone on at exactly the same time as an unprecedented wave of secularization in the last 20 years, just something close to a collapse of Christianity, especially denominational Christianity in America. And that's not a coincidence.
So what would you point to? So you've pointed to like these kind of structural issues in our society. What does that lead to if Christianity continues on that course of collapsing? Where do we go from here? Do we take a turn and enter a secular utopia, or do we go in some other direction?
Well, if I can tell a little bit of my own story here, this book is an apology for the dumbest thing I ever wrote, or at least maybe the wrongest thing I ever wrote. Because in 2003, so I'm a secular Jew. I'm an atheist. I'm gay, and I grew up with a very bad attitude toward Christianity because it seemed to have no place in the sun for someone like me. And I underwent a process of coming to understand that religion and faith plays an important role in our public life. But even so, in 2003, I was still in a place where I wrote for The Atlantic a kind of, to be candid, a gloating article celebrating what I called apatheism, which is that religion was just fading, I said, as an important part of American public life. And I celebrated this. I said, this is a civilizational advance because religion is divisive and it's dogmatic. And as we have less of it, we'll get more like Scandinavia. We'll all get along better. We'll be more harmonious. it'll be a more successful society. And I was just completely wrong about that for all the reasons we cited, and then there are more in addition. So it looks like what's happened is that the decline of organized religion, I can give you the numbers on that. They're startling. It's just in the last 20 years, it's been a sea change, unprecedented secularization. In the course of that, we've seen all these indicators turn down, which I mentioned earlier. We've seen the rise of substitute pseudo-religions, some of which are, kind of maybe harmless, like, I don't know, Wicca, soul cycles, self-improvement, psychedelics, but they can't do the job that the great faith traditions can do of setting high moral standards and creating a sense of community and mutual worship. And then even worse, you've got politics as a religion. And that's just toxic. So in the short run, where this seems to be leading is to what some people have called the God-shaped hole, and people looking to fill that spiritual gap in life with pseudo-religions and actually kind of negative kind of fake religions like extreme wokeness and MAGA and QAnon and radical environmentalism. In the longer term, in the 50 to 100-year term, sure, maybe we can find substitutes for what Christianity has historically done in America. But we don't know yet if that's the case. And we know that right now we've got something like a crisis happening. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. I think I still, I'm pretty familiar with the kind of trajectory that you are on in terms of, I think you've talked about the new atheists kind of beginning to shift in the direction of being much more, I don't know, graceful towards religion in terms of thinking about its role in society, and being concerned about what happens in its place, like what kind of rises to fill the gap as a traditional religion such as Christianity declines. I think it's interesting because this is a trend. I know G.K. Chesterton talks about this, like a century before, right? About what happens as you remove Christianity from public life. You don't become less superstitious necessarily. You maybe fill that void with other kinds of superstition that might even be more dangerous. I even think Carl Sagan had an intuition of this. So that's a
Nietzsche
thing that
warned about this over.
Yeah. So
Over 100 years ago, God is dead.
Right, and that's a thing that I know that when I think there are still people who don't have that intuition that that's what happens, right? They feel like, okay, we're just going to secularize as a society, and then we're going to all be free of superstition. To me, that feels like, yeah, it hasn't. It's insufficient awareness of what's happening in the world around us. But let's talk about like what it would mean for that you're bringing this kind of critique or this this point of view, right? Because you're not religious yourself. You're saying, okay, we need perhaps traditional religion to hold something up here. How do you distinguish between kind of the need of the society, the community, and the individual?
Well, they all have needs and they interact. Before we remind me of that question in just like 3 sentences from now, because I just want to underline something that you just said.
Yeah.
Which is that we're talking about the need for Christianity in public life, and people like me not appreciating that as much as we should have. And that's very true. But the message of this book is actually more presumptuous than that. which is the need for Christianity in Christian life. And the ways in which the church itself, first the mainline churches, but then the evangelical church in this century, have gotten away from the message of Jesus and the fundamental truths that he preached. And especially in the white evangelical church, a much more politicized, partisan version of Christianity. So that gets to the point that you were asking about, which is the role of I think you said the individual and society and the church itself. I'm not sure if I got the three right, but maybe that's close.
And talking with someone about this, if you're saying that we do need Christianity in our liberal democracy, I think a very common thought would be, well, I don't need it, right? Like, and you're in that category as well, right? You're someone who doesn't personally need it. And well, so how would you?
Yeah, I am. I'm trying. I'm really not one of those people. And there are some who say, well, I don't believe in that stupid religion stuff, but I'm glad those other people do. Because I have come to see that they're supremely important questions in life that secular liberalism cannot answer and doesn't even really try to answer. And one of them is, why am I here? What larger purpose do I serve? Am I really no more than just a random clump of cells that exists for a universal microsecond? And secular liberalism doesn't have an answer to that. It doesn't try to answer that. It says, go somewhere else for that. And we go to faith for that. And it turns out that the answers that we come up with when we feel needs to answer these questions, which many, if not most people do, the answers you get from Christianity and Judaism are a lot deeper and richer than the answers you're going to get from, I don't know, Soul Cycle or QAnon. So a second thing that secular liberalism cannot answer is, what's the foundation of good and evil, right and wrong? Where does morality come from that's bigger and deeper, more transcendent, more fundamental than just, so I prefer this, you prefer that? That's not a question which secular liberalism has been able to answer. And these are questions which, although not necessarily every individual needs to be religious or believe in any particular religion, you do need to be informed by the faith traditions that have given us socially the answers to those questions. And so secular liberal society by itself is incomplete. The founders told us that, by the way. In as many words, they said, we're giving you Constitution, we're giving you processes, Republican processes, but you're going to need to go outside of those processes to get what they called Republican virtues, the underlying virtues and needs that go behind that. And by where they wanted people to go, they meant, okay, family, community, schools, but in very large measure, they meant Christianity. Not that this is a Christian nation or you have to believe in Jesus Christ to be a good American, nothing like that. But just they took for granted that people would have these, the rich acculturation into Republican virtues, things like honesty and civility and being truthful and being educated on important civic matters. They thought that civil society and religion would provide that. So on all these levels, at least for the time being, we don't really have a good alternative to Christianity to be the load-bearing wall that upholds those things in our democracy. So that's why I think we all have a stake in it.
Yeah, that's interesting. The thing that comes up for me in talking about that, you're saying essentially there is this history that we're all drawing from, whether we're secular or religious, or in fact whatever religion we're part of. If we are participating in a liberal democratic society, we are drawing from a tradition that has its own kind of backstory and origin story. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's fair. Or to put it another way, that that our Constitution, our liberal democratic order rests on a substrate of values and norms and morals that rest on these great religious traditions. But I'll give you an even deeper answer. It really goes to the core of my book, which is, there's books out there that say religion plays an important role sociologically. It creates joint worship and togetherness, and it connects people, and people are happier if they're religious than if they're not. I'm not one of those books about the generic importance of religion. What this book is about core teachings of Jesus Christ, how they overlap with the core teachings of James Madison and the founding fathers. So what this is saying is that you don't have to be a Christian to believe that Christ got three extremely important things right. And those are three things that underpin our liberal democracy as well as the Christian faith. And those three are three pillars of Christianity. Number one, don't be afraid. Most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible, maybe the whole Bible. Number two, imitate Jesus. Be egalitarian, the equal worth and dignity of every human, and especially look out for the weak among us, the marginal, the minorities. And number three, forgive each other. That this world, as well as our politics, is not about retribution, revenge, making the others, conquering and dominating the other side. It's about creating a world where we can live together. So those three things are true in both frameworks, secular and religious. But if Christianity is not preaching those things, if it's preaching the opposite of those things, partisanship, threat, fear, then our society comes apart because of that misalignment. And that's the core idea.
So in that, well, I want to come back to your prescription for our society and for Christianity, which gets to those, what you just brought up. But let's talk for a minute about why Christianity is failing. You talk about the mainline church, you talk about the evangelical church, maybe failing in different ways. What is the process here? Is this two different dynamics, or one dynamic playing out over in two different phases? Like, what's going on?
It's two versions of the same underlying phenomenon, which is secularization. So Christianity is a countercultural faith. Unlike Judaism, unlike Islam, it's not born to rule with the state. It's born very much as an outsider, separate from the state. Jesus is a profoundly countercultural figure. He's very much unlike the surrounding society, and he bids Christians to focus on the next life, not the next election, and the power of God, not the power of man. And so Christianity is has its most integrity. Now, I'm getting all this from Christians, so don't take my word for it, but Christianity has its most integrity and its most missionary appeal when it's not like the surrounding culture, when it's countercultural. So secularization is when a religion loses that countercultural quality and becomes like the surrounding culture. I call this a cultural trade deficit, that it's absorbing more from the surrounding culture than it's exporting. And that happens in two big ways. The first is the so-called mainline or ecumenical churches in the last half of the 20th century. And these go from being just pillars, extremely important institutions in American culture, so much so that when I was a kid, people introduce themselves often not by asking, what do you do or where are you from, but which church do you belong to? But they decide in the latter half of the 20th century, for reasons that make sense at the time, to get away from teaching the Bible and being countercultural and engaging in kind of social justice politics, faith through deed, redemption through deed, not through faith. And they reached the point where, as one Presbyterian retired minister that I talked to just a couple of weeks ago said, it got to the point where you'd have, the Bible studies and the group meetings in the church, and they wouldn't even mention God. So they became secularized in that way, and people fell away because, if it's going to be so much like the rest of society, who needs it? It's not doing much for you. Mm-hmm. So the story in the latter half of the 20th century is the mainline church's collapse, but the evangelical church gets stronger because it remains countercultural. It's conservative, but it has that difference to it on sexual morality, for instance, from outside society. It's biblically based. It's preaching something different, something demanding. And for a while it grows, it takes up the slack, and then in this century, it collapses. We see a flight from the white evangelical church. And that's driven by a few things, but one of them seems to be a second form of secularization, and that takes the form of politicization. So starting in the 80s and then into the 90s, church leaders, white evangelical leaders, this is Pat Robertson, Lou Sheldon, of course, Jerry Falwell, enter partisan politics, align white evangelicalism with the Republican Party, and make a gamble that the church can affect partisan politics more than partisan politics can affect the church. And that's a gamble that they lose. And in the 21st century, they align so tightly with the Republican Party that there's almost no difference between the two. 80+% of white evangelicals vote for every Republican presidential candidate since McCain, no matter who it is. And that begins to change the nature of the church. So first, it begins to shrink because people who are not there to do politics no longer feel as welcome. They drift away. And second, people come into the church who are more focused on partisan politics and less on church life. And in fact, you get a big rise in the percentage of church members, of self-identified white evangelicals who never set foot in a church, 1 in 8 now. So the church gets smaller and it gets more partisan and polarized. That's what I call sharper. And it gets less like teaching the countercultural ethos of Jesus Christ and more like just another way of doing the culture wars. So at the end of this process in 2025, you've got both wings of the church, which are no longer either able or willing, it seems, to do the job that the founders needed the church to do, which is be countercultural and teach these core values.
So it strikes me that you're offering a version of the kind of conservative evangelical critique. You're just additionally applying it to conservative evangelicals as well. Like I grew up hearing that kind of critique of the mainline churches, that they had lost their biblical ethos, their kind of spiritual core, and had just become indistinguishable from culture. And so the Bible-based churches were growing instead. And you're saying, yes, that's pretty much right. But now the conservative evangelical churches have also become indistinguishable from culture. Is that?
That's the general idea. Of course, they're never completely indistinguishable, but I was just the other day listening to Matthew D. Taylor talk about his book on this and talk about how deeply infected white evangelical movement, led by something called the New Apostolic Reformation, how much it now views Donald J. Trump as a messianic figure, a kind of secular monarch, a kind of King Cyrus, verging into worshipfulness. And that's not very Christ-like. I mean, you tell me, you're a member of, I think you said the Churches of Christ.
Yeah.
But I'm getting all this from Christians. This is not something I made up.
Right. Yeah, that's certainly not the way I would have understood the message growing up in my congregation, in terms of what we would expect a Christian leader to be like, to exemplify, those sorts of things. Yeah, I grew up when there was a lot of concern about Bill Clinton and his seeming lack of certain character traits that felt important. And the sense among people I was around that was disqualifying, right? This lack of kind of integrity or character, and that message has shifted in a lot of contexts I'm exposed to. So yeah,
you know about the polling on this, probably
tell me.
Maybe one of the most striking polling results of the 21st century is from the Public Religion Research Institute. In 2011, they asked Americans, people of faith, whether I won't word the question exactly right, but it's the right basic idea. Whether a politician, a leader, needs to be a person of good character, whether character matters a lot in a leading political figure. And white evangelicals of all Christian denominations are the ones who say it's the most important. 2/3 or more of them say, yes, character really matters. So that's 2011. In 2016, they asked the same question. And this time, guess which group of all Christians is the least likely to say that character is an essential quality in a major political leader? And if you've guessed white evangelicals, you are correct. And so now ask yourself, what happens in 2016 that would cause this flip? It's like 2-1 in one direction, and then it flips 2-1 the other direction. White evangelicals are saying character matters the least. And so to answer that question, if you'll indulge me for another minute on this, in 2016, in January, candidate Trump goes to an evangelical college called Dordt College in Iowa and gives a speech there. And in this speech, he says two things. I will wage you dollars to dimes that you did not know he said these two things in the same speech. One thing he says is, my followers are so loyal that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and they wouldn't mind. You've heard that he said that. Mm-hmm. In that same speech, a little earlier, he also says, if you elect me, he's talking to a white evangelical audience, if you elect me, you will have power. Remember that. Mm-hmm. So think about the deal that he's offering. I will give you power. You will give me unconditional loyalty. Okay, now go back to your Bible. Matthew 4, for those not watching, Micah's grinning. I think you see where this is going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have an intuition here.
Jesus is baptized, and in preparation for his ministry, he spends 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, and there he encounters Satan, who brings him to the highest mountaintop in the world, shows him all of human dominion, and says, you can rule all of this if you'll just bow down to me. And Jesus, of course, says, go away, Satan. Mm-hmm. So what happens in 2016 is the white evangelical church takes the bargain that Jesus rejected. They say, all right, we need political power. And to do that, we're going to make compromises on things that until now we said were essential to our teaching. And that means, okay, so power is important. You care about abortion. I get that. You care about values. I get that. But there's going to be a cost to projecting hypocrisy to the world and showing the world that you never meant what you said you stood for. And that cost is seen in the demolition of the church, the rapid shrinking that has seen, the cynicism that's arisen between 2007 and 2021. The percentage of Americans identifying as Christian dropped by 15%. That's a percentage point every year. The percentage of people saying they had no religion increased by 14%. People are just streaming away from Christianity in this period and into having no religion at all. And that's got to be partly because you're looking at Christianity and thinking, you mean this was really just about politics the whole time?
So I can foresee a criticism or critique of the point you just made, which is, aren't we always doing that in politics? Aren't we always kind of going into the room and making some kind of compromise that we feel icky about? We feel, betrays something, but that's the necessary cost of operating in society. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say a couple things. The one is about the nature of compromise, and the other is about the nature of Christianity. So people get compromise completely wrong. This is one of my crusades in life. Compromise is at the core of the Constitution. If you were to summarize the US Constitution in a handful of words, it would be it's a compromise forcing mechanism. And that's because James Madison, the greatest political genius who ever lived, understood compromise is not about splitting the baby so everyone's unhappy. Compromise is a creative, dynamic force in which people with different visions get into a room and try to figure out creative solutions that allow them to walk out of the room better than they came in. If you just think about the way children play, you see this. Bobby wants to play checkers and Susie wants to play chess, and they can't figure out what to do. So maybe they go find Billy or Michelle and they play something else, or they bring new ideas, or they invent a new game. Compromise is a dynamic, creative engine that brings in new people, it brings in new ideas, it forces us to stretch, it forces me and Micah to say, well, we disagree, but hey, what about this? What about this other idea? Maybe we can do this as well. That's the whole notion of our republic. Compromise is creative and dynamic and constructive. So first of all, those people are wrong about compromise. It's not about sacrificing your values. It's looking about creative solutions to increase the space to live together within those values. But the second thing is about the influence of Christianity. Okay, let's suppose, sure, politics can be grubby. It can be about transactional exchange. That's just a part of it. So then the question becomes, so how should Christianity inform that process? Should it inspire people to enter politics with a sense of existential fear, that they're under threat, that if they ever compromise with the other side, that will be, an apocalyptic disaster for them? Or should they enter politics with an attitude of not being afraid, of exhibiting a certain calm and a certain generosity, a certain respect for the core humanity of the other person, not a spirit of dominating them or controlling them, but a spirit of humility and equality? And it seems to me that the Jesus way is a lot more like the Madison way than it is like, for example, the MAGA way.
So you make a case for Christian support of liberal democracy. You've made a case that liberal democracy needs, at least in our form, needs Christianity, and this is the role that the founders kind of foresaw for it. But you also make a case that I think that you're suggesting that Christianity needs liberal democracy in some sense.
Yes.
And how would you articulate that? Why does Christianity need liberal democracy? Why shouldn't Christians just say, well, this experiment has failed, let's move on to the next form of government, whatever that might be?
Because first of all, we've got a couple thousand years of history that tell us that when Christianity, or really any other religion, but when Christianity tries to run a whole society by itself, it goes off the rails. It loses its humility. It becomes corrupt. You see some of the very syndromes that are happening in Christianity right now as it seeks to dominate and rule. A second thing is just what we talked about. So liberal democracy can't do everything. It can't answer those existential questions we talked about, but it's really good at some other things. It's good at pluralism, at allowing a very diverse society, people with different religions, backgrounds, regions, values, to function together. It's good at setting up processes for compromise and for rotation and power and all those other things which religion is not very good at. And so I mentioned I'm gay, and have been involved in the LGBT equality movement since the early 90s. The big part of my life was same-sex marriage movement. Religion by itself tends to become absolute and extreme. And liberalism has again and again helped Christianity and our other religions get along with others, teach ways of toleration and pluralism. Liberalism has been combined with the core ideas of Jesus Christ, the equal dignity of every person. But combined with that, it's given a process to emancipate Blacks and women and gay people. That's the genius of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Well, that's right out of Jesus. It's also right out of Judaism, all people created in the image of God. But it's the liberal political and social system that creates the dynamic engine that allows that to unfold over time in our politics. So I picture Christianity and secular liberalism as they're both like planks of wood. If you try to stand one up, it's not going to stand up. But if you lean them on each other, they will stand up.
So there's something you've alluded to in evoking the Declaration of Independence and the background of that. I think it's the case that that liberal democracy arises within a Christian culture and specifically within a Protestant Christian culture, right?
Specifically, yes, a white Protestant culture.
And people like James Madison grew up in a Christian culture and wrote to a Christian culture, and their ideas were taken up into a Christian culture and implemented in a Christian culture. So to me, that makes a strong kind of historical case to Christians that this is a outgrowth of our value system. And it was, as far as I can tell, it was understood as an outgrowth of the Protestant Christian value system by many people over the last several centuries. They did take liberal democracy as a sort of I don't know, partner of Christianity that needed to be defended and protected because it was an expression of Christian ideals and values. It strikes me that kind of context would make it more compelling for Christians than if we take a framing of saying, well, liberal democracy is over here and you need to kind of compromise with it, this kind of alien thing. I don't know. Does that resonate with you? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it does resonate, and it's complicated, and that's the whole problem, right? These two things, secular liberalism, our constitutional system, and all that it asks us to do, like pluralism, which says, you're going to live in a society where you think maybe abortion is murder, but other people think it's a basic human right. You're going to have to cope with that. It's very challenging. It's very difficult. At its best, Christianity makes some very difficult demands of people. Jesus is calling people to look to the next world and to sacrifice in this world. So these things are difficult enough on their own, but two things are also true when you put them together. One is that they need each other because they're both incomplete. Each one answers questions that the other one can't, whether it's the fundamental reason why we're here, or whether it's creating a coherent picture of the universe, which only science can do. So they need each other, but they're also always in this creative tension. And the trick is, this is what the founders told us needed to happen, but it's not easy, is that they can't be, partners. This is not going to be a Christian nation where other faiths are second-class citizens. They specifically rejected that. So it's not that Christianity and the Constitution are allies per se, but they need to stay reasonably well aligned. If they're pulling in different directions, they'll pull society apart. And so that's the trick. Can we manage this tension? And that's where I think a lot of Christians have gone off the rails in the last, especially 20 years. But a lot of secular liberals, and I include myself, also went off the rails. I think we forgot, if we ever knew, but we forgot how important religion generally, but really, I mean specifically Christianity is in our liberal democracy. We forgot that it was a load-bearing wall, and so we neglected it, and sometimes we were outright hostile to it. And so this book is an apology for that, and it's a call for secular liberals to say, this bargain with Christianity, we need to uphold our end too.
So when I've talked about this with about this book with Christians, one of the responses I get is, well, it sounds like you're asking a lot of Christians, and you're sort of saying, okay, you know, Christians are needed to uphold the Constitution and our democracy and so forth. So Christianity needs to reform. It's not okay as it is, right? It needs to sacrifice and get back to the teachings of Jesus. And maybe cynical or critical look at that would be to say, well, what are our secular brothers and sisters willing to sacrifice, right? Like, are we in a sense sponsoring this a non-religious lifestyle where, you know, maybe that demands a lot of us as Christians, and maybe it doesn't demand, you know, if secular people are free to go without those demands. Is that a fair bargain, or is there another way of thinking about that?
Well, there is another way of thinking about it, and I would direct it, I guess, to you, Micah, as a Christian. But I get this, you know, I'm an outsider, so who am I to preach to the church? But I get this from folks like the late Tim Keller, who's a co-dedicatee of the book, and Russell Moore, the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, who's written a wonderful book called Losing Our Religion, an altar call to American Christians, and many others. And I don't think, I guess I don't really see why it would be calling upon Christians to make a sacrifice for the sake of the rest of us, to suggest that Christianity uphold and elevate the core values of Jesus Christ. To me, that's supposed to be part of the package. Even when upholding the values of Jesus Christ are difficult or is countercultural, even when it requires sacrifice, Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice for those values. And so I think that's what Russell means by an altar call to American Christians. He's kind of saying, so are we Christians or not? Do we mean what we say about the Gospels or don't we? He relates that it used to be that young people who were losing their faith would come to them and say they weren't sure anymore that what the church was teaching was true. And he says now when they come to him, they're saying, we're not sure that the church believes what the church is teaching is true. Mm-hmm. And he also says this wonderful phrase, if you want to know why so many young people are leaving the church, maybe it's because if all you give them is a choice between politicization and secularization, they're going to choose one or the other. So I guess I'd question the premise that elevating those core parts of Christian teaching, which align with and are so important to the core parts of liberal democracy, that's really calling on Christians to give up something. So that's the first part. But the second part is, okay, if you want to be transactional about it, there is a call in my book. It's not the bulk of the book, but it's important. I think secular liberals have not upheld our part of the bargain of making sure that America is a welcoming and accepting, more than accepting, a welcoming environment for Christians. that we appreciate and understand the importance of Christianity as a load-bearing wall in our democracy. And for example, inclusion programs in workplaces and universities and newsrooms just pretty much never include people of faith. They'll ask about race and they'll ask about lots of things, but are they really checking to make sure that people in the workplace, people of faith, feel comfortable? I know Christians in lots of workplaces who say, it's not that they're oppressed, it's not war on Christianity, but it's like, I'm kind of on the down low about my faith because I just think my secular colleagues would think it's weird. That's wrong. We seculars, we need to be curious, welcoming, and affirming of people of faith. It wouldn't cost us an arm and a leg to go to services sometimes and see what that's like, to make sure that people of faith feel comfortable openly professing their faith among us. We do not need, I'm a gay man, I'm LGBT rights activist. We do not need to require that every single mom and pop bakery in the country caters same-sex weddings. There are plenty of other bakers. We can make room in society for religious people to go on about their business with more generosity than we have. So yes, we also need to do more. I also happen to think that these things I'm telling you are not sacrifices in the sense that we're giving something up. I think actually we expand ourselves as humans and as a society if we make ourselves better, if we bring in more people of faith and more of the fundamental ideas of faith. I think that improves us.
I like that. I want to talk in terms of these two different kind of pillars. You talk about the things that they need each other for, and one of them is you deal with epistemology. So you mentioned a minute ago science. I think you said is the best way or the best tool we have for understanding the world, something like that. And so this is I think as you framed it, is a thing that religion or Christianity does not have in itself. So it needs to kind of go to the liberal stream of tradition to pull into it. And I wonder if there is the possibility of some kind of deeper ultimate reconciliation between these things rather than just a kind of uneasy tension. I know you've talked about Popper, and I know your previous book, the Constitution of Knowledge, deals with Popper and Charles Sanders Peirce, and this kind of idea about epistemology. I don't know. I have an interest in that. What do you think about the prospects of finding some reconciliation between whatever kind of spiritually derived truths we think we have and this scientific process of pursuing truth?
So other people have different answers. It's an age-old question. My own answer to that, offered with humility, is that suppose instead of having an oil and vinegar salad dressing in which the two mingle but remain distinct, you could blend them together into vinegoil. It would probably not be as good a salad dressing. That faith and science partly complement each other because they're doing different things, and you don't want them to be two ways of doing the same thing. So I believe that faith and supernatural forces, for example, is fundamentally epistemologically incompatible with science because science rules out miracles. I mean, you just can't say in science, well, how did fish fossils get to the top of a mountain? Well, it must have been a miracle, because that just shuts down the conversation. So no, you can't have scientists doing religion on the lab bench. Just as you can't have religious people going to services and saying, what kind of experiment can we do to prove that Jesus Christ is God? It misses the point of faith. And yet, in greater minds than mine, they can coexist. I have a literal mind that I have come to realize that this is, I am not a person of faith. I tried at one point when I was 14. I couldn't do it. The material scientific world is the only world that I know. And I have come to see that as, I used to say, well, that's good for me, because I don't need the crutch of superstition. But getting to know people of deep faith who are much smarter than I am, like, Francis Collins, one of the greatest living scientists, former director of the National Institutes of Health, mapper of the human genome, is a deeply Christian person. And somehow he is able to be a great scientist while also believing that Jesus Christ died and was resurrected 3 days later. He doesn't go to the lab to try to prove that, and he doesn't need to. Now, Micah, you can tell me how it is that you and folks like you are able to have both of these worlds in your life. I can only tell you that I feel I am the poorer because I don't have access to that spiritual side. I tell people it's a little like being colorblind. I'm happy being who I am. I'm perfectly content. But there are aspects of human existence that my worldview does not reach.
I think my answer to that actually, it makes more sense to me because of people like Karl Popper and that way of thinking, where it's not that we start with something to prove, the way a lot of Christian apologetics has typically done, but it's rather that we start with a conjecture that we have some reason to be interested in, and then we set out to falsify it, right? And so science does this at scale, right? Like we float all kinds of conjectures and then falsify them, or at least critique them over and over and over. In my mind, the convictions of faith are similar sorts of conjectures. They don't rely on a set of proofs that can get us there. They are conjectures that are compelling. They have some kind of internal coherence, logic to them that feels like this deserves to be investigated. And religion is, unfortunately, some conjectures take lifetimes, generations to explore and to work out. And so Christianity has had 2,000 years to explore the conjecture that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And what I observe, kind of leading to some of the pragmatic things that you've talked about, I observe that faith communities that affirm that thrive, and faith communities that don't affirm that or that move away from that in some ways don't thrive. And so that, I don't know what to do with that. It's not I haven't reconciled all those things, but it's a live conjecture for me, I would say, in an epistemological sense, that I can't let go of, right? And so that goes to, what I would see as the some of the problems with modern day faith as well. But something like the epistemology that you touch on in your previous book, one of the things you say is something like truth is community, or knowledge is community, something like this. Maybe you can phrase that better than I have, but that strikes me because it does move us beyond the question of whether, in a similar way to these questions about secularity and religion, it moves beyond the question of whether I specifically have to have a certain belief, and to the question of what is our community, what is the relationship of our community to belief, to knowledge, to truth, and to so on. Does that make sense? The points I'm raising, does that connect at all with the kind of epistemology that you're working with?
I'm not sure I exactly got the question. Is it Is it that the communal nature of the search for truth ties back to what?
Well, it ties back to the fact that you are seemingly able to advance a vision of a pluralistic society with a very strong Christianity and yet a thriving secular community.
Yeah.
Even though
Yeah.
there are kind of internal tensions in this, you see them as relying on each other in some ways.
Yeah, and also intention. I call it a thick Christianity is what's desirable here. Countercultural, demanding a lot of its members and giving a lot in exchange, different from the surrounding society, yet compatible with liberal democracy. That's a tall order.
Mm-hmm.
I think at some level that does grow out of the larger vision of where knowledge comes from. So my previous book, the one that you're alluding to, is called The Constitution of Knowledge. And the working idea of that book is that where knowledge comes from in a free, peaceful, prosperous, and reality-based society is not just some unstructured marketplace of ideas. That just gives you chaos and 4chan and X. It's a constitution of knowledge. It's a structure of rules and institutions that guide us in the process of free speech and criticism and critiquing, and force us into a process that's very much like political compromise, except it's persuasion. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that's all about that process of building knowledge through a community according to rules. And where this book goes with that is saying, so what's the basis for those rules? Part of it in our society has been Christianity. And when Christianity doesn't want to defend those rules, then those rules start to get really weak. Mm-hmm. And one thing that we've seen happen is, the arising of these whole alternative realities around, everything from was Hillary Clinton running a pedophile ring from a pizzeria in Washington, to election denialism, and then the weird woke stuff on the left, that human sexuality is a spectrum. That's not true. I mean, human sex is a spectrum. It's just not true. So once you unmoor yourself from this process of forcing each other into this rigorous form of persuasion, reality can go anywhere and governance can go anywhere, and you get chaos and nihilism. I don't know. Did I get in the ballpark of where you were trying to head with that?
Yeah. I mean, these are very interesting and complex things that you're touching on here, and it's not within my capabilities, I'm afraid, to tease out all of the ramifications that are there. But I think I really do think the framework that you're working with in the Constitution of Knowledge and this idea of institutions and systems, we would almost say liturgies around how we formulate knowledge and how we formulate consensus and so forth. Like, this is not it's not a commonplace idea, I think, but it is incredibly significant. I would even think about, in terms of how we're building AI now, how we build these systems into the technology that we build, both in social media type environments and in all the other kinds of technology. I think thinking about that, wrestling with that, there's a lot there. Real quick, your focus, I think, to a large extent in this book is on the evangelical church, the white evangelical church. But when you talk about the kind of church that you idealize, you use Mormonism or the LDS church as an example. So can you clarify what you're aiming at in talking about Mormonism, and how someone in kind of more the evangelical world should use that or take that that exploration, what they should do with that.
Yeah, I'd love to. The most important place to start is to say that I am not telling Christians that they need to become Latter-day Saints or adopt Latter-day Saint theology. And there are examples in my book of evangelical Christians who are doing some of the same kind of work. But so here's the core idea. The thesis that we've been talking about is that America is becoming ungovernable because Christianity is failing at its role, at what the founders wanted it to do. Well, what's that? The broadest way to state it is provide a civic theology. So, okay, what's that? The church today, white evangelical church, is pretty good at what it calls discipling people or spiritual formation. And that's the process of making people Christ-like in their personal lives. And that's, the family life, church life, community life. When the hurricane comes, the churches are going to be there. They're probably going to be awesome, a lot of them. But there's been a giant hole and a big sucking sound about civic theology, which asks the question, how would Christ want Christians to behave in civic life, meaning essentially in politics and on social media? And there you see extremely un-Christ-like behavior from a lot of Christians. And so there's this disjunct. It's like, as David French has put it, people are saying, well, I may be a bit of an asshole on Twitter, but you should see me in the soup kitchen. And that won't do. Christianity's an all-encompassing philosophy of life. But if Christianity isn't discipling people into a civic theology, secular world will rush into that space, and that's what happened. You see many Christians adopting the worst of secular behavior in those spaces. Not all of them, but a lot. So I look around. This is an inspiration for the book, actually. I look around at America and say, so who is articulating a full-blown civic theology based on Christian values? And the answer is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They're doing this consciously. It's a worked out doctrine. It's been developed and promulgated, especially, though not only, by the number 2 person in that church. His name is Dallin Oaks. This book was generated partly by a speech he gave in 2021, in which he said that although he's a constitutional lawyer by profession, that he was there as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ to say that the way God wants Christians to address the civic realm is in a spirit of patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. And what he means by that is not give up on your values, but it's bring those values to your public work in a way that tries to expand the space for people of different views to live together. Deconflicting. They call this peacemaking in the church. And what's interesting about this is not a tactic or a strategy. This is grounded very deeply in the fundamentals of theology, going right back to the Garden of Eden. And my book talks about what that theology is, and it talks about the work that they've done in actual congressional politics on behalf of that work, getting actual results in a bill through Congress. Amazing stuff that they're doing, and in Utah. But the bottom line is that what they're showing is that you can bring this vision of a Christ-like politics to the civic realm in ways that help heal the political process and actually form real-world compromises that do some of this healing, and in ways that are consistent with the fundamental values of the church. And then I also talk to Christians like Michael Ware of the Center for Christianity and Public Life, and the author of a wonderful book called The Politics. Oh, no, I'm going to forget. Anyway, Michael Ware, W-E-A-R,
Mm-hmm.
The Spirit of Our Politics, who are also doing the same work.
Mm-hmm. So, it strikes me, you see the theology as really significant here, that there is a theological grounding.
Theology really matters.
Yeah. One of the things that I kind of laughed at, at one point in the book, you say, surprisingly, the Book of Mormon and James Madison converge, and and I laugh because with apologies to my Mormon friends, Mormonism arises in the same kind of context that that James Madison's ideas were being implemented. I wouldn't exclude the possibility of overlap there. And that gets back to what I was saying earlier, where I think much of our theology is influenced by this long history of a tradition of thought about liberal democracy. That itself has worked its way into many churches. And as I was suggesting, I think it emerged within churches as well. So I don't see it as kind of an alien force that has to be integrated in some way. I think it naturally does arise with a sufficiently deep engagement with Christian theology, including, as you explore in your book, like different ways of reading the account of Eden and the fall and human nature and so on and so forth. But I think the core thing, as you pointed out, does come down to what Christians would phrase as the image of God, or what the Constitution talks about, all men being created equal. Like, that is a very deep idea that I think does lead naturally in those directions. I don't know, for a specific congregation who is trying to do their part to save democracy and do all this, right? And they are, what do they do? Do they need to sit down and work out their own kind of political theology? Do they need to wait for somebody else to do this? Do they need to look to people like Tim Keller or someone? Like, what's the
So
best approach there?
the answer to that question is yes. Those are not mutually exclusive options.
Mm-hmm.
So Curtis Chang, David French, and the aforementioned Russell Moore have actually done the work, or doing the work, in something they call the After Party Project. And that's a curriculum for small groups in evangelical churches. That actually it's practical ways of relating to each other in a highly politicized partisan environment. It is not about partisan politics. It's about discipleship in a more Christ-like way of approaching politics. As Curtis Chang says, it's about not the what of politics, but the how of politics. And that's the key notion. It's not what does Jesus Christ tell you to believe is the right outcome. It's how does Jesus tell us to approach our fellow citizens as Christians? And it's a curriculum, and it's available, and it's going now, and they've actually done some research on it. They're headed into their second or maybe even third year. So that's one example of a curriculum that's already out there that's doing that work. And there are some other groups, Christians, that are trying to do that work of creating curricula for spiritual development. There's also things that individual congregations can do. Now, one example that comes to mind is not Christian, it's Jewish. But it's coming out of the same sense of alarm, which is, what can we do as people of the book to be constructive in this partisan environment that's tearing us apart? So this is my rabbi friend, Michael Holtzman of Northern Virginia Hebrew congregation. And they've created a curriculum of what they call great texts of our democracy, which integrates into part of the Torah teachings great texts from our tradition, things like the Emer Lazarus poem that's for example, on the Statue of Liberty, and bring those into the larger conversations about what the Torah's implications for the Constitution are, and vice versa. And now they're rolling that out to other synagogues. They've developed a curriculum. So there's activity in this space, and there are these resources available for congregations that want to start doing this work. And that work begins with theology. It just begins with asking the question, okay, if we're serious about the teachings of Jesus, what is it that we as Christians can bring to our politics right now that would have the same kind of transcendental healing? And what I'm saying as a secular outsider is we need your help.
Well, John, I know I've kept you too long. I very much appreciate the conversation. I want to say about your book. I found it very clear-eyed. To maybe it just comports with the way I understand the world, but it seemed very clear on a lot of things that are happening and what's at the root of it, and so on. So I really did enjoy this book. I'm going to have a link to that, Cross Purposes, as well as your previous book, The Constitution of Knowledge. Anything else that people should explore or look up, or that you'd like people to know about?
Well, those are my two most recent books, so they're a good start. I have a website, jonathanrauch.com, and it's where I post some, not all, but many of my articles. But yeah, start with Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy. It's a really short book. It's only 40,000 words on purpose. Mm-hmm. And it's meant to be kind of a brief and hopefully impactful testimonial to the importance of Christianity and Jesus right now, and why we secular people need more Christianity, not less.
Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll talk soon.